Hello and welcome back to the Hudson Hangout. Today I'm interviewing Paul Bushnell. He is a very accomplished bassist and keyboardist, originally from Ireland. He's played with many talented artists, including The Weeknd, Chris Cornell, Celine Dion, Elton John, Jason Mraz, Faith Hill, and Tim McGraw, just to name a few. He's also made all the music for The Commitments, the movie. Paul and I had so much fun talking that we went a little long. You'll see part 2 of this episode coming out soon. Please like and subscribe. Hi, Paul.
Hello, Hudson. How are you?
I'm good. Now, let's get this interview on with.
Come on, let's go.
How did you get into music?
Well, I grew up in Ireland, which is quite a ways away from here, and I was lucky to grow up in a very musical family. My mother was a beautiful singer and became very well known in Ireland and traveled here actually to the United States, was actually given the freedom of New Orleans after she performed there, I was so proud of her. And my dad played the drums, and my sister is a singer, and my grandparents played piano and sang, and my grandfather on my dad's side played the upright bass, the big, huge upright bass. So I was pretty well surrounded by music. So it would have been weird if I didn't become a musician.
Can you tell me a little more about that?
Sure. And I like that you asked that question, because my journey, even though I just, gave you an insight into the crazy musical world that I grew up in, I actually played music through my teens, but I then went to college to study physics, math, and computer science. Now, this is computer science in 1983, when Apple and companies like that were only just beginning. So I was trying to dive into something that I really kind of did love, but I was walking down a pedestrian street in the center of Dublin city one afternoon, on a Saturday afternoon, and I saw a lot of people gathered on the street, and I heard this great singing and guitar playing and everything coming from this crowd. And I looked in, and there were 4 guys that I knew from college playing music on the street, and something just went inside me, and I was like, oh my goodness, this is what I have to do. And so, much to my parents' horror, so don't ever do this to your parents unless there's a really good reason, I left college and I started playing music on the street. And that was the beginning, truly, of my journey as a musician.
How did you get into bass?
I was playing music in a little rock band in my high school, basically. And I was playing electric guitar. And I also, at the same time, was playing music in a church choir, but it was kind of like a cool church choir. We did this really cool, sort of almost like hippie folk music. This was the end of the 70s, and I really enjoyed that. And one day, the bass player called in. He's like, I'm so sick, I can't come in, I can't play, can somebody else? And the leader of the group just handed me the bass guitar like 10 minutes before we were supposed to do a 2-hour mass sort of musical celebration. And I started playing, and I loved it right from the very beginning. I loved it. And that was it. There was no other instrument for me. I was like, I am playing the bass. And that's how I started playing bass.
When you first started playing bass, did you play with your fingers or with a pick?
Beautiful question. I played with my fingers. Basically because I loved, at that point in time, a band called Led Zeppelin. And Led Zeppelin are kind of a heavy rock band. They are really a heavy rock band, but in a very, they could do a piece of music that lasted half an hour and would take you on all these amazing stylistic journeys as it went through that piece of music. And the bass player in Led Zeppelin is a guy called John Paul Jones, and he is still alive and still playing bass, and he's producing records. He's probably he could be in his 70s, could be in his early 70s now, but what a bass player. And he played with his fingers like this. Almost everything I ever saw him do, he was playing with his fingers. And he was like he was a soulful bass player. He played like James Jemerson and people like that, who were Jemerson was the most famous bass player in R&B music back in the 60s and the early 70s. And Jamerson would do a lot of very musical bass playing. And I listened to John Paul Jones in these huge rock tracks, and he was doing all this amazing musical bass playing. And I was like, I'm going to learn from that guy, because that's the way I want to play. And also, I guess I then started listening to Jaco Pastorius, who is one of the most beautiful musicians ever to have been born. And he also played with his fingers and played mostly fretless bass, and was a genius. A little bird told me that you maybe started playing bass recently. Is that correct? Or you're learning?
Yes.
Okay, so
my bass is right behind me.
There's your bass right behind. I actually
and
didn't
I can
notice.
see that you have a couple guitars and basses behind you.
I have one or two here, one or two behind. I just thought you'd enjoy seeing them because you are going to be a bass player, right? And so I sort of listened to all of the music, which was very stylistically different. And that was a good thing for me, because I learned how to do different things at quite an early, I guess you're starting way younger than me. I started playing bass when I was maybe 17 and a half, maybe, or 18 years of age. So I started really late playing bass, but I just adored it. And then everything I heard on the radio, everything I saw on the TV, every video I saw, this was at the time of the beginning of music television, MTV, and I would see all these bass players. I'd be like, oh, look at that. Look at his fingers. Wow, that's amazing. And look at that bass. And this is the. So I just fell in love. That's what happened.
What was your big break?
Okay. I guess the biggest break in my life was an amazing set of circumstances that happened over a period of maybe 8 years. Me helping somebody with something, who introduced me to somebody, who I helped with some music for a year, who called me 3 years later and said, hey, can you help me with something again? I became the music director of and the producer, co-producer with my buddy Kevin Killen, who's like my brother from another mother, and Alan Parker, who was the director of the movie. I became the music producer of a music called The Commitments, which came from Ireland. And it may be, you might be a tiny bit young yet for it, because there is some very colorful language in it, because Irish people tend to sometimes use a lot of colorful language, but they don't use it in a mean way. It's almost just part of dialogue. So in this movie, there's a lot of colorful language, but this was my big break. And this movie brought me to the United States for the first time. And I fell in love again with the United States. And I was like, oh my gosh, I have got to live here. There is so much amazing music. There are so many amazing and beautiful musicians. And I started meeting people very quickly. And because of the success of the movie, I started meeting some incredible people, like people who are legendary musicians and producers. And I knew I had to live here. And then talk about luck. Let's talk about, you asked me about luck. I'm going to tell you the second amazing piece of luck. I just happened to arrive here in a year that the American government issued 16,000 green cards for people from certain countries. And one of those countries was Ireland. So I qualified to be considered for a green card, and I got it. So then it was like, oh my God, America is going to be my home, you know? So, and I'm still, I have to tell you this, honestly, of course, Ireland is in my heart forever, but I wake up every morning in California, the happiest man in the world. I love it here. I just love it, even though it's crazy and it's expensive and it's all, but it's beautiful.
Yeah, California is really the most beautiful state.
Were you born in California? Is this where you lived your whole life?
Yeah, I'm
Okay.
down in LA.
Yeah. Well, I don't plan on leaving unless LA decides it wants to kick me out. I don't plan on leaving because I wake up smiling every morning.
How did you start getting on albums of such chart topping artists?
That was a process that happened kind of quickly in a way. I got into, let's say, around 93, between 93 and 98, just after I arrived here and decided I was staying. But I started as I sort of had a conversation with myself. Sometimes you got to have these like, okay, what am I doing? What do I want to do? How can I do what I want to do? Is that what I really, really, really want to do? So I asked myself those questions, and I realized that having already gone through a sort of an apprenticeship, if you like, in Ireland, playing with a lot of really great people, I still had another apprenticeship to do here because there was a massive palette of brilliant and beautiful musicians that I wanted to try to play with. So I started just playing in little coffee houses and little clubs, sometimes for free, sometimes for $20, you know, like literally starting at the beginning. And fortunately for me, people would come in and some of them would be in the business and they would, and they'd come up to me afterwards and like, hey, are you free on Thursday? Can you come play on something for me? I'm like, yes, of course. Yeah, I'd love to. And I'd go play on something. And then if it worked out fine, which thank goodness it did, you know, most, if not all of the time, that person would tell somebody else. And in the meantime, I'd have played another show and somebody else would say, hey, can you come and play on? So just these dots kept connecting. And before I knew it, the artists were getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And I definitely have been very fortunate. Opportunities I probably would not have had in Ireland, because in Ireland, I was a chameleon. I could put on a different hat every day. I could go in and play a rock track or be in a band, because I didn't do a lot of recording in Ireland. I played more live music all the time. So I'd be playing with a rock band on, let's say, Monday night, but with a big jazz band on Tuesday night, and with a punk band on Wednesday night, and weirdly, that didn't translate as being cool. It translated as, well, who are you? What are you? You know, and I was looked on as this person who wasn't really committed to anything. At least some people looked at me that way. When I came to the United States, that was such an advantage, because everyone just embraced, you will go, can you come play on my track? Yes. And I go and I could feel their music. I think that's what I'm trying to say to you. I was lucky that I was able to sit down in a room with somebody, hear a song for the first time, and feel where their inspiration and their heart was in this song, and hopefully bring the bass to that place.
That brings me to my next question. How did you get a gig with The Weeknd? They're one of my favorite artists.
That basically, well, that goes back really to being in a band that I began to tell you about in 1993. That band had a very, unfortunately, forgettable name, which was Edna Swap. So it was like this bizarre word that meant nothing really. It was a dream that our lead singer, this amazing songwriter named Anne Previn, had. And to cut a long story short, we ended up writing a huge hit song that we recorded, but also somebody else recorded it, this girl named Natalie Imbruglia, and it became a huge hit. It was a song called Torn. Well, one of the people in the band, in fact, it was Anne, about 2 years ago, maybe 2.5 years ago, recommended me to a guy named Stefan Mocchio, and Stefan was going to be producing The Weeknd. So I came into Stefan's studio, and he loves, after that experience, he loves a certain thing about the width of my bass sound and the fact that I have been doing this long enough to have the right kind of discipline to only play what is really necessary. There's I wouldn't call it a little bit of a sickness, but it's something I'm concerned about, that a lot of particularly younger bass players feel that they have to be able to play 1,000 notes in like 3 seconds. And that's not important, not really important at all. It's all about the space, really. I mean, space and bass, they rhyme. It's poetry. If you play a note and leave some space, you're creating this groove. And that's what bass should really do. It should make you move if you're listening to it. Anyway, Stefan, he loved the space and the width, the size of the sound of my bass. And we had an amazing time doing that track. And we spent a few hours doing Earned It, because it wasn't a completed work yet. He still had 1 or 2 things to add, but we wanted to see how much, because he had, if you remember that song, it has very big strings. It has these beautiful strings in it. And my bass had to complement the sound of these strings. So it worked out really great. And I did another couple of songs actually for The Weeknd on the same album. So that's the story.
Oh, okay. During a recording session with an artist, has there ever been like a blooper or a funny story or something gone wrong while recording?
Ooh, good question. I would have to, wow, that's a good question. You have me slightly stumped. Let me, I will say that with the right group of people, which luckily, because the music community in LA is quite small, and if you do certain styles of music, you end up seeing the same people in the studio on a regular basis. So I have friends now for 20 years who I've been in the studio with a lot. And more than like wild and wacky things happening, we laugh. Like, we laugh. It is so much fun. And it's sometimes, I feel sad sometimes when I talk to sometimes people telling me about their experiences of making their record, maybe a record I haven't been involved in. And they are like, oh, it was so heavy and intense and it just wasn't fun. And I'm thinking, what are you doing it for then? It should be fun. So I'm struggling to think of something crazy, apart from really maybe being so into, this happened to me once on a rock record where I was so into performing, because when I'm in the studio, particularly if I'm maybe overdubbing on something, I'll most likely stand up and I will imagine myself on stage. And if the if the artist, if the song has a huge amount of energy, I will just start jumping around the place and playing while I'm recording. Well, one time, and thank God, there was a couch well behind, but my chair was right behind me. And I started like moving around. And of course, went straight onto my chair, which was on wheels, and completely went from underneath me. I went flying, the bass collapsed down on top of me, and the noise that came from the speakers nearly deafened everybody in the room. So I was then politely asked, Paul, less dancing, please, while you're playing. Less dancing. That was what. I'm glad you reminded me of that. I had forgotten about that.
Yeah, that sounds like something my dad said, is that the bassists usually have a reputation of being very funny and loose in the studio.
Well, that's, you see, a bass is an interesting place. And as you become a bass player, you'll realize this. You have to be very aware of everything that's going on around you, musically, everything, because what you do on the bass can completely alter the feeling and the mood and the essence of the song, you know. And sometimes that can be phenomenal if you take your idea and instead of going to the expected place, you go to the left a little bit and you make it a little bit, and suddenly it's like, oh wow, I never thought of it that way, and they get all excited. The bass player is listening to everybody, and you know, I'm not going to be mean to guitar players, but most of the time they're kind of listening to themselves, you know what I mean? They got, you know, they're like, hey, I'm cool, and they don't really listen to everybody else. So of course my guitar playing friends are going to, you know, they're going to disown me now after I've said this to you, but the bass player definitely has maybe the smallest ego in the room, but perhaps the biggest job. And so I think we are at liberty to have fun because we don't have a huge amount of, oh, I gotta be really loud and everything here, and you know, hope people hear me, and you know. So we're not really, you know, we're not really like that. We're like, okay, this is good. I like this. I'm having fun. This is cool, you know. And I think that that allows us to have a lot more fun in the room and to be, if you like, the funny guy, you know.
Yeah.
It's a beautiful place to be. I love
Yeah.
it.
You're supposed to be listening to everyone around you, since you have to be with the drums and the backbone, like the metronome of the song.
Absolutely,
absolutely.
bass, yeah. You know what we call it? The engine room. We're the engine room. We're the motor, you know. If you just have the bass and the drums play together, people will dance.
Yes.
Right? People will dance. If they're grooving, if they're playing really well together. And then you add elements and it just gets better and bigger and there's more color. But if you took all those elements away again and just had the bass and the drums, people will still dance. Yeah, and when I say people will dance, I mean people will feel the groove of it, you know? And that's what we have to do. We got to be the engine room. We got to be the end. Look at you. You got the groove. I know you're going to be, but I'm going to be like 20 years from now, I'm going to be like, you know what? I knew that guy Hudson. I'll be standing out the door of your gig. Hey, I know Hudson. Can you get me in? He's a friend of mine. He remembered me, the guy in the orange hat. I taught him everything he knows about playing the bass. Believe me. Whoops, I just knocked my glasses off. I say, believe me, that's going to happen. You see, it's fun being bass players, right?
Yeah.